The steel doors of Trauma Bay 4 slammed shut, but the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoing down the corridor promised they wouldn't hold. Bleeding out on the gurney, the Navy SEAL gripped the ER nurse's wrist with bone-crushing force, his eyes locking onto the shattered reinforced glass. Touch her and die. The torrential Seattle rain battered the reinforced glass of Providence Regional Medical Center, drumming a chaotic rhythm that perfectly mirrored the graveyard shift in the emergency department. Madeline Hayes wiped a stray lock of auburn hair from her forehead, her scrubs already stained with the residual chaos of a multi-car pileup that had cleared out just an hour prior. At 32, Madeline was the charge nurse, a hardened veteran of gunshot wounds, overdoses, and the dark underbelly of the city that inevitably washed up on the hospital's pristine linoleum floors. It was 3:14 a.m. when the proximity alarms in the ambulance bay shrieked. Madeline didn't wait for the intercom. She sprinted toward the double doors just as a matte black Chevrolet Tahoe, completely devoid of license plates and riddled with heavy-caliber bullet holes, smashed through the security barricade and skidded to a violent halt beneath the harsh halogen lights of the drop-off zone. Before the hospital security guard could even unholster his radio, the rear door of the Tahoe kicked open. A massive figure tumbled out onto the wet concrete, leaving a thick dark smear of arterial blood against the vehicle's chassis. The driver, masked in a balaclava, didn't wait. The SUV immediately peeled out, tires screaming against the slick pavement, vanishing into the storm. Code Trauma, Bay 1. Get a gurney now. Madeline barked, her voice slicing through the sudden paralysis of the U.S. staff. Nurse Jackie Ortiz and an orderly named Wyatt sprinted behind her, pushing the heavy striker stretcher into the freezing rain. Madeline dropped to her knees beside the man. He was huge, at least 6 feet 4 inches of pure dense muscle, currently clad in shredded tactical gear. A heavy plate carrier devoid of any military insignia or agency patches was strapped across a chest that was currently heaving with wet, ragged gasps. Sir, can you hear me? Madeline asked, her hands flying over his body in a rapid trauma assessment. Her gloves immediately soaked through with hot, slick blood. He had taken at least 3 rounds, one grazing his thigh, one embedded deep in his left shoulder, and the worst one, a high-velocity entry wound, just below his ribs on the right side. The man's eyes snapped open. They were a piercing icy gray, completely dilated from adrenaline and shock. His massive hand, covered in tactical gloves and blood, shot out and clamped around Madeline's forearm with terrifying strength. They're coming, he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a chill down her spine. Lock the doors. We're getting you inside. Wyatt, lift on 3. 1, 2, 3. They hoisted his massive frame onto the gurney. The man groaned, coughing up a fine mist of blood, a terrifying indicator of internal pulmonary hemorrhaging. As they rushed him through the automatic doors and into Trauma Bay 1, Madeline began shouting orders. Jackie, get to large bore IVS, 14 gauge. Start a rapid infuser on cross-matched O negative. Page Dr. Miller, tell him we have a John Doe, multiple GSWs, probable tension, pneumothorax, and hepatic laceration. As they stripped him of his ruined tactical vest, a heavy metal object clattered to the floor. Madeline kicked it aside, a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't gang violence. This was professional. Name, I need your name, Madeline demanded, leaning close to his ear as Jackie frantically hooked up the monitors. The ECG machine began to scream, his heart rate rocketing to 140, while his blood pressure plummeted to a terrifying 70/40. Dominic, he breathed out, his grip on her wrist tightening again. Dominic Russo, listen to me, nurse. Madeline, my name is Madeline. Stay with me. Dominic, Madeline, he choked out, forcing the words through immense pain. The police, if they show up, don't let them in. They aren't cops. Blackline, they own them. Before she could process the warning, the heavy double doors of the ER waiting room slid open. Madeline glanced through the glass partition. 3 men in Seattle PD windbreakers had just walked in, but something was horribly wrong. Their windbreakers were crisp, untouched by the torrential rain outside. They weren't wearing standard duty belts. They wore drop-leg tactical holsters, and the way they moved, slicing the angles of the room, hands resting subtly on the grips of their sidearms, screamed military close-quarters combat training, not local beat cops. Excuse me, miss. The lead man, a tall, cold-eyed operative with a jagged scar along his jawline, said to the triage receptionist, "We got a report of a gunshot victim dropped off by a black SUV. We need to see him." Now Madeline's blood ran cold. She looked down at Dominic Russo. The Navy SEAL's eyes were rolling back, his body going into profound hemorrhagic shock. He was right. The wolves were already inside the wire. Madeline didn't hesitate. 10 years in the ER had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now every alarm bell in her nervous system was deafening. "Jackie," Madeline whispered, her voice dangerously calm. "Hit the code silver button. Do it now." Jackie's eyes widened in horror. "Madeline, those are cops. Look at their boots." "Jackie," Madeline hissed, keeping her back to the glass. "Standard issue is black leather. Those are Salomon tactical quest boots, same as the military. They're dry. It's been raining for 6 hours. Hit the damn button." Jackie lunged for the wall panel. She slammed her palm against the red emergency lockdown button beneath the plastic casing. Instantly, the hospital's atmospheric alarms began to blare, a harsh rhythmic pulsing. Heavy steel magnetic doors, designed to withstand riot breaches and contain active shooters, began to descend from the ceilings across the corridors, sealing off the trauma ward from the main waiting area. Through the reinforced glass of the triage window, the lead officer turned, his cold eyes locked onto Madeline. The facade dropped instantly. He didn't shout for a badge or demand compliance. Instead, he unholstered a Sig Sauer P320 with a threaded barrel, leveled it at the bullet-resistant glass, and fired 3 rapid shots. The heavy glass spiderwebbed, violently holding together but obscuring the view. "Move!" Madeline screamed, grabbing the head of Dominic's gurney. Wyatt and Jackie pushed from the sides, rolling the heavily bleeding SEAL out of Trauma Bay 1 and deeper into the secure, sterile corridor of the surgical wing. The heavy magnetic doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening metallic clack, locking out the waiting room. But Madeline knew Providence Regional's layout better than anyone. The lockdown secured the main arteries of the hospital, but the secondary access routes, the basement maintenance tunnels, the pneumatic tube choke points, the loading docks, were vulnerable. If these men were professionals, and the suppressed weapons suggested they were, they would bypass the magnetic doors in minutes. Dominic Russo began to seize on the gurney, his monitor flatlining in a terrifying sequence of alarms. "He's in Vifib, grab the crash cart," Jackie yelled, panicking as the sterile hallway lights flickered. "No, look at his neck, tracheal deviation to the left," Madeline diagnosed rapidly, grabbing a scalpel from an emergency suture kit on a passing tray. "His right lung has completely collapsed. The pressure is crushing his heart. He's not in cardiac arrest. He's suffocating from the inside." They shoved the gurney into sterile supply room B, a massive windowless storage area filled with surgical equipment and titanium implants. Madeline locked the heavy steel door from the inside and shoved a massive cart of saline boxes against it. "I need a 14-gauge needle now," Madeline ordered, ripping Dominic's chest bare. The bruising was horrific. The right side of his chest was hyper-expanded and hollow-sounding when she tapped it. There was no time for anesthesia, no time for Dr. Miller. If she didn't vent the trapped air, the SEAL would be dead in 60 seconds. She found her landmark, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Taking a deep breath, Madeline drove the long hollow needle directly into Dominic Russo's chest. A loud, violent hiss of escaping air filled the room, followed immediately by a horrific spray of trapped blood that splattered across Madeline's scrubs. Dominic's chest immediately deflated to a normal size, and the heart monitor on the portable defibrillator spiked back to a sinus tachycardia rhythm. Dominic gasped, his back arching off the gurney as oxygen flooded his remaining functional lungs. His eyes snapped open, blazing with violent primal awareness. The painkillers hadn't even begun to touch him. He reached up, ripping the oxygen mask off his face. Before Madeline could push him back down, the heavy steel door of the supply room shuddered. A massive echoing bang reverberated through the metal. A breaching charge. "Get back," Dominic growled, rolling off the gurney. His legs buckled instantly, his blood loss too severe, but he caught himself against the stainless steel shelving. He looked like a wounded apex predator, bleeding, cornered, and infinitely dangerous. The door violently blew open, hinges screaming as the steel warped. Smoke poured into the sterile supply room. Through the grey haze stepped one of the mercenaries, his weapon raised, the laser sight cutting through the smoke and landing directly on Madeline's chest. Target acquired. The mercenary barked into his comms, stepping into the room. He didn't even look at Dominic, assuming the bleeding man was incapacitated. He reached out to grab Madeline by the throat, to use her as a human shield. He never made it. Dominic lunged from the shadows with terrifying, inhuman speed. He hadn't used a gun. He had grabbed a heavy medical-grade titanium bone saw from the surgical tray. With a guttural feral roar, the bleeding alpha seal drove his forearm into the mercenary's throat, pinning him against the doorframe, and brought the heavy instrument up to the man's temple. "Touch her and die," Dominic growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise. Before the mercenary could pull the trigger, Dominic twisted, snapping the man's wrist with a sickening crunch, taking the sidearm and delivering a devastating strike to the mercenary's jaw that dropped him unconscious to the floor. Dominic swayed, coughing up more blood, and leaned heavily against the doorframe, the captured gun now in his hand. He looked at Madeline, his icy grey eyes softening just a fraction. "You saved my life, Doc. Now it's my turn to save yours." The power grid to the surgical wing abruptly died. Emergency backup generators kicked in, bathing the corridor in a sinister low-light crimson glow. The hospital's automated voice began echoing over the PA system. "Code Silver. Security protocol engaged. All personnel shelter in place." Madeline grabbed a trauma kit, stuffing it with quick clot gauze, morphine syrettes, chest seals, and extra 4 bags. She tossed a clean set of green scrubs to Dominic, who was currently stripping the tactical vest and spare magazines off the unconscious mercenary. "Put those on," Madeline ordered, her voice trembling but authoritative. "Your blood-soaked gear is a biohazard and a tracking nightmare. If they have thermal optics, you're glowing like a beacon." Dominic grunted, pressing a wad of gauze against his bleeding side. "You're calm for a civilian. Most people would be screaming in a corner by now." "I've been an ER nurse in Seattle for a decade," Madeline replied, tying off a pressure dressing around his shoulder. "I've dug bullets out of cartel bosses and stitched up gangbangers while their rivals waited in the lobby. You're just a bigger, deadlier version of my Tuesday night." Dominic let out a harsh, rasping chuckle that ended in a wince. "Chief Petty Officer Dominic Russo, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." He checked the chamber of the captured Sig Sauer. "We need to move. That breach charge just alerted the rest of the assault team." "Who were they?" Madeline asked, leading him out of the supply room and down the red-lit sterile corridor toward the freight elevators. "They aren't local PD," Dominic said, his eyes scanning the shadows. Moving with a fluid tactical grace despite his severe injuries, Blackline security, private military contractors, high-end mercenaries, supposed to be working for the DoD overseas, but a few months ago an FBI Joint Task Force uncovered they were using their maritime logistics contracts to smuggle weapons-grade uranium and untraceable arms through the port of Seattle. They were selling to domestic terror cells. Madeline felt a sudden icy chill radiate through her chest. The name Blackline struck a horrific, buried chord in her memory. 2 years ago, her older brother, a prominent investigative journalist for the Seattle Times, had been working on an expose regarding corruption at the commercial shipping ports. He had called her one night, terrified, muttering about a PMC group running a shadow operation. 3 days later, his car was found at the bottom of the Puget Sound. The police ruled it a drunk driving accident. Despite her brother being a devoutly sober man, she had never been able to prove otherwise. "My team," Dominic continued, his voice tightening with grief and rage, "was tasked to raid their warehouse tonight to secure the ledgers. It was a trap. Our intel was leaked. We walked into an ambush. 3 of my brothers died in that warehouse. I barely made it out." He tapped his blood-stained chest. "I swallowed a microSD card before the Tahoe crashed. It has the encrypted ledgers, proof of Blackline's treason, and proof of who inside the federal government is protecting them." "Russo," Victor's voice echoed down the hall, dripping with dark amusement. "You're bleeding out, Dominic. There's nowhere to run in this fishbowl. Hand over the drive and I'll make sure the pretty nurse lives. Make me hunt you down and I'll skin her alive right in front of you." Dominic didn't answer. He grabbed Madeline by the waist, shoving her forcefully behind the heavy steel doors of the maintenance shaft, just as a hail of suppressed gunfire shredded the drywall where they had been standing a second prior. In the pitch black of the vertical maintenance shaft, with the smell of old rust and hot steam surrounding them, Madeline pressed her back against the cold brick. Dominic was pressed flush against her, his massive chest heaving, his blood soaking through her scrubs. The proximity was electric, terrifying, and intimate. She could see the faint glow of Victor's tactical flashlight sweeping the corridor outside the grate. "I know who Victor Kalin is," Madeline whispered, her voice barely a breath against Dominic's neck. "He killed my brother 2 years ago." Dominic froze. He looked down at her in the darkness. the icy grit in his eyes shifting into something far more dangerous, a lethal, terrifying syndicate of shared vengeance. Then we aren't just surviving tonight, Madeline, the Alpha SEAL growled softly, racking the slide of his pistol. We're going to kill every last one of them. The rusted iron rungs of the maintenance shaft was slick with condensation and Dominic's blood. The vertical tunnel, a relic from Providence Regional's original 1950s architectural footprint, smelled sharply of copper, hot steam, and decades of undisturbed dust. Below them, the muffled, suppressed gunshots of Victor Callan's mercenaries echoed through the surgical corridors, a relentless, terrifying metronome. They were hunting, sweeping room by room, executing anyone who had seen their faces. Madeline Hayes climbed directly below the massive Navy SEAL, her shoulders bearing the brunt of his slipping combat boots every time his wounded body faltered. The sheer physical exertion required to haul his 240 lb muscle-dense frame up the vertical shaft was destroying him. The tension pneumothorax she had decompressed was holding, but the high-velocity entry wound below his ribs was a catastrophic problem. The makeshift pressure dressing was thoroughly saturated, the thick, dark arterial blood weeping through the bandages and dripping onto Madeline's upturned face. "Keep moving," Madeline urged, her voice a desperate, echoing whisper in the claustrophobic dark. She reached up, pressing her palm flat against the sole of his boot, physically shoving his leg upward to help him gain the next rung. 4 more floors, Dominic. We have to reach the psychiatric ward on the 8th floor. It's closed for renovations. The elevator shafts cap off there, and we can access the roof hatch through the mechanical room. Dominic grunted, a wet, ragged sound that tore from his throat. His breath was coming in shallow, shuddering gasps. Left side going numb, he rasped, his massive fingers slipping on the rusted iron before finding purchase. Hypovolemic shock, losing too much volume. I have 2 bags of saline and a liter of Onagdiv in the trauma kit, Madeline said, her chest heaving as she climbed. Just get us to the 8th floor. I will pump you full of fluids, but you have to keep climbing. If you stop, you die. If you die, I die. Move. He drew a sharp, agonizing breath, the sheer force of his legendary Tier 1 willpower overriding his failing biology. They climbed in excruciating silence for what felt like an eternity, the ambient temperature in the shaft rising steadily as they bypassed the massive boiler vents. Finally, Dominic reached the heavy steel grate of the 8th floor ventilation exit. With a guttural roar, he shoved the rusted panel outward. It crashed onto the linoleum floor of the abandoned ward. He hauled himself through the opening, collapsing onto the dusty floor tiles with a heavy, lifeless thud. Madeline scrambled up behind him, rolling out of the shaft, and immediately dropping to her knees beside him. The 8th floor psychiatric ward was a desolate, cavernous space. Sheets of translucent plastic hung from the ceiling, billowing slightly from the drafts. Discarded hospital beds and overturned supply carts littered the long, shadowy hallway. The emergency backup lights bathed the abandoned ward in a sinister, flickering red glow. Dominic was unconscious. His skin was the color of wet ash, his lips tinged with cyanosis. The Alpha SEAL, a man forged in the brutal fires of Coronado and the mountains of Afghanistan, was finally succumbing to the devastating blood loss. "No, no, no, you don't get to quit," Madeline hissed, ripping open the trauma kit. Her hands were shaking violently, but 10 years of chaotic ER trauma protocols took over. She worked with savage efficiency. She slammed a 14-gauge 4-needle into his thick median cubital vein, attaching the rapid infuser tubing. She hung the bag of O-negative blood on the handle of a nearby overturned wheelchair, squeezing the bag fiercely to force the life-saving fluid into his collapsing veins faster. Next, she grabbed a pair of trauma shears and cut away the side of his green scrubs. The wound was horrific. The bullet had shattered a rib and lacerated his liver. It was actively hemorrhaging. A surface dressing wouldn't stop it. She had to pack the wound. "I am so sorry, Dominic," she whispered, her voice cracking. She tore open a package of combat gauze impregnated with a hemostatic chemical agent designed to force rapid blood clotting. Madeline jammed her fingers, wrapped in the chemical gauze, directly into the bullet hole. Dominic's eyes snapped open instantly. A horrific, choked scream ripped from his throat. His body arched violently off the floor in pure, unadulterated agony. His massive hand shot out and grabbed Madeline by the throat, not out of malice, but pure blinding neurological reflex. His grip was crushing, cutting off her airway instantly. "Dominic, it's me," she choked out, fighting to pry his thick fingers off her windpipe while keeping her other hand buried deep inside his bleeding abdomen, applying immense internal pressure to the lacerated liver. For 3 terrifying seconds, his dilated grey eyes stared right through her, lost in a haze of combat trauma and blinding pain. Then the recognition flickered. He released her throat instantly, his hand dropping to the floor as he gasped for air, trembling violently. "Sorry," he gritted out, his teeth clenched so hard she thought they might shatter. "The packing, it burns. It's the kaolin clay in the gauze." Madeline gasped, rubbing her bruised neck. "It triggers the clotting cascade. Hold your hand over it. Press down hard. We don't have much time. As soon as Kaelin's men clear the surgical wing, they'll check the main security cameras. Gregson will tell them exactly where we are." As if on cue, the heavy double doors at the far end of the psychiatric ward slowly pushed open. Madeline froze. She grabbed the captured Sig Sauer pistol from Dominic's side and leveled it at the shadows. A figure stepped through the plastic sheeting. It wasn't a mercenary in tactical gear. It was a man in a crisp white shirt, a tactical vest worn over it, holding a standard-issue Glock 19. It was Gregson, the head of Providence Regional's hospital security. His face was pale, glistening with nervous sweat. "Put the gun down, Madeline," Gregson said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty ward. He kept his weapon aimed squarely at her. "Victor Callan sent me up the service elevator to secure the roof access. It's over. The entire hospital is locked down. The police outside have been ordered to stand down under the guise of a federal hostage situation. Blackline controls the narrative. They control the perimeter." Madeline felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over her. She stepped in front of Dominic, shielding his prone body. "You sold us out. You let them slaughter the staff in the ER. How could you, Gregson? You were supposed to protect this hospital." Gregson let out a bitter, trembling laugh. "Protected with what, Madeline? Flashlights and pepper spray. Blackline offered me $2 million to look the other way while they moved their cargo through the hospital's medical waste disposal trucks. Nobody checks biohazard shipments. It was the perfect smuggling route for their weapons-grade materials." Madeline's breath hitched. The missing puzzle pieces of her brother's murder violently clicked into place. "That's what my brother found out. He didn't just stumble onto the port smuggling. He found out you were using the hospital. You told Callan about him." Gregson's eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, heavy with a coward's guilt. "He was asking too many questions, Madeline. He cornered me in my office. I didn't want him dead. I just told Kaelin to scare him off. But Victor Kaelin doesn't scare people. He eliminates variables, just like he's going to eliminate you. Hand over the microSD card. Go to hell." Madeline spat, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't be stupid," Gregson warned, raising his Glock. "Russo is bleeding out. He's a dead man. Give me the drive and I promise I'll tell Kaelin you slipped out the fire escape. I will let you live." Before Gregson could finish his sentence, the shadows behind him moved. Dominic hadn't been lying helpless on the floor. While Madeline kept Gregson talking, the Alpha SEAL had silently rolled beneath a discarded row of hospital beds, using the thick plastic construction sheeting as camouflage, flanking the security chief with the terrifying stealth of a phantom. Dominic rose up directly behind Gregson. The SEAL moved with fluid, lethal grace, his massive arm wrapping around Gregson's neck in a textbook rear-naked choke. Gregson panicked, wildly firing his Glock into the ceiling. The deafening gunshot shattered the silence of the ward. Dominic didn't flinch. With a brutal, violently efficient twist of his powerful shoulders, he snapped Gregson's neck. The crack was sickeningly loud. The security chief went completely limp, dropping to the floor. Dominic swayed, leaning heavily against the wall, his face completely drained of color. He kicked Gregson's Glock away. "Talking is a tactical error," Dominic grunted, coughing up a fresh splatter of blood. "They heard that gunshot. The assault team is coming. We need to hit the roof now." Madeline rushed forward, pulling Dominic's heavy arm over her shoulder. The grief over her brother's murder had crystallized into a cold, terrifying rage. She didn't feel fear anymore. She felt a burning, absolute need for retribution. "The mechanical room is at the end of the hall. The roof hatch is inside. Let's finish this." The heavy steel door of the mechanical room slammed shut behind them. Madeline dropping the heavy iron barricade bar into place, just as heavy tactical boots began pounding down the hallway of the psychiatric ward. They had mere seconds. Above them, the metal ladder led directly to the roof hatch. The storm outside was raging with apocalyptic fury, the thunder masking the sound of their desperate breathing. Dominic climbed first, using his good arm, while Madeline pushed from beneath. He shoved the heavy metal hatch open, and the torrential Seattle rain immediately poured into the shaft, instantly soaking them to the bone. They dragged themselves out onto the vast, flat expanse of the hospital roof. The wind was a howling tempest, whipping Madeline's auburn hair wildly around her face. The sprawling skyline of downtown Seattle was a blur of neon and rain. But up here on the slick black tar paper of the roof, they were entirely exposed. The transmitter! Dominic yelled over the deafening roar of the storm. He dragged himself toward the massive rotating satellite dish that serviced the hospital's telecommunications network. He pulled a heavy military-grade encrypted satellite radio from his tactical belt, the only piece of gear he had retained. He violently shoved the microSD card into the side port, connecting the radio's hardline to the hospital's massive satellite array to boost the signal. "I need 2 minutes to upload the encrypted ledger to Naval Special Warfare Command," Dominic shouted, his fingers flying rapidly across the radio's keypad. "Once it transmits, the FBI and the DoD will have everything. Blackline will be dismantled. Warrants will be issued instantly." Suddenly, the steel roof hatch they had just climbed out of violently exploded. Shrapnel and twisted metal rained down across the slick tarmac. Through the billowing smoke and torrential rain, Victor Kalin emerged. He was flanked by his 3 remaining elite operatives, fanned out with ruthless precision, their suppressed carbines leveled directly at Dominic and Madeline. "Upload cancelled," Kalin sneered, wiping the heavy rain from his scarred face. "It's over, Russo. Step away from the terminal. Kick the drive over to me." Dominic stood slowly. He was entirely unarmed, having given his captured pistol to Madeline, who was currently taking cover behind a massive HVAC unit. The SEAL was bleeding heavily, his uniform soaked in rain and blood, but he stood tall, an immovable mountain of lethal defiance. "You're too late, Victor," Dominic growled, his voice carrying over the thunder. "The progress bar is at 80%. In 30 seconds, every federal agency in the country will have your name." Victor's eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. "Then I'll just have to kill you and smash the terminal." He raised his carbine, aiming directly at Dominic's chest. "Execute them." Before the mercenaries could pull their triggers, Madeline made her move. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a veteran of the ER. She understood anatomy, chemistry, and electricity. Peeking from behind the HVAC unit, she saw the massive high-voltage breaker box that powered the hospital's industrial air conditioning systems. The rain was pooling heavily around the metal grating where Kalin's 3 operatives were standing. Madeline didn't hesitate. She raised the Sig Sauer pistol with both hands, aimed at the heavy master lock on the electrical panel, and fired twice. The lock shattered. Madeline kicked the metal door open, revealing a maze of thick, exposed high-voltage industrial cables. Grabbing a heavy insulated rubber maintenance wrench from the ground, she violently smashed the ceramic insulators holding the live wires, knocking them completely loose. The massive cables, sparking with terrifying raw electrical current, dropped directly into the deep metallic puddle covering the grating where the mercenaries stood. The water instantly electrified. 2 of the mercenaries convulsed violently as thousands of volts of raw industrial electricity surged through the water and into their soaked boots. They were thrown backward, their bodies smoking in the torrential rain, instantly incapacitated. Victor Kalin, standing just inches outside the puddle, spun around in sheer shock. That momentary distraction was all Dominic needed. With a primal, earth-shattering roar, the wounded Alpha SEAL launched himself across the slick tarmac. He didn't fire a weapon. He hit Kalin with the force of a freight train, tackling the mercenary leader to the ground. The carbine skittered away into the darkness. The 2 men engaged in brutal, savage hand-to-hand combat. Kalin was highly trained, completely uninjured, and armed with a serrated combat knife. He slashed wildly, tearing a deep gash across Dominic's forearm. Dominic didn't even flinch. He absorbed the pain, his grey eyes burning with the cold, calculated fury of a man avenging his fallen brothers. Kalin lunged forward, driving the knife toward Dominic's throat. Dominic caught the man's wrist, the sheer crushing power of the SEAL stopping the blade mere inches from his jugular. For a terrifying second they were deadlocked, the rain washing blood over their hands. Madeline sprinted out from behind the HVAC unit, desperate to help. Kalin snarled, using his free hand to punch fiercely at Dominic's gunshot wound. The impact forced a ragged gasp from the SEAL, his grip faltering for a microsecond. Kalin broke free, raising the knife for a fatal downward strike into Dominic's chest. Madeline didn't have time to aim the gun. She tackled Kalin from the side, driving her shoulder into his ribs. The impact knocked him off balance, giving Dominic the fraction of a second he needed. Dominic surged upward. He grabbed Kaylin by the tactical vest, lifted the mercenary leader off his feet with a terrifying display of raw, adrenaline-fueled power, and slammed him backward against the jagged rusted edge of the destroyed roof hatch. The sickening crunch of Kaylin's spine snapping against the iron frame echoed over the thunder. Kaylin collapsed, his body sliding down the twisted metal, his eyes wide with shock and sudden paralyzing agony. He gasped for air, unable to move his arms or legs. The reign of Victor Kaylin was permanently over. Dominic collapsed onto his knees, his massive chest heaving, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked back at the satellite terminal. The green light on the console was flashing rapidly. Upload complete. Transmission secure. Madeline dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. She pressed her forehead against his chest, listening to the erratic, rapid thumping of his failing heart. "You did it," she sobbed, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her overwhelmed with relief and exhaustion. "Dominic, you did it. The data went through. My brother finally has justice." Dominic leaned heavily against her, his hand weakly resting against her auburn hair. A faint, exhausted smile touched the corners of his mouth. "We did it, Doc. You fought like a seal tonight." Suddenly, the deafening chop of heavy rotor blades sliced through the storm. Emerging from the low-hanging clouds, a massive MH-60M Black Hawk helicopter, painted in absolute matte black and bearing no official markings, flared over the hospital roof. The side doors slid open, revealing 4 heavily armed operators in full tactical gear. The quick reaction force from Naval Special Warfare had arrived. 2 medics fast-roped down to the slick tarmac, sprinting directly toward Dominic and Madeline. "Chief Russo, we have you." "Chief, hold on," one of the medics shouted, immediately dropping his medical bag and beginning a rapid assessment of Dominic's catastrophic wounds. Dominic looked up at the medics, then forced his heavy gaze over to Madeline. His grip on her hand tightened one final time before his eyes fluttered shut, his massive body finally surrendering to the darkness. "Get him on the litter now. We need a massive transfusion protocol en route to Bremerton Naval Hospital," the medic ordered, waving the helicopter down closer. As they loaded the bleeding Alpha SEAL onto the stretcher, Madeline refused to let go of his hand. She climbed into the back of the Black Hawk alongside the operators. The military men didn't stop her. They had seen the carnage inside the hospital. They knew she had kept their commanding officer alive. As the Black Hawk lifted off the roof of Providence Regional, soaring into the dark, stormy Seattle sky, Madeline looked down at the flashing police lights finally breaking through the Blackline barricades below. The nightmare was over. The corrupt empire had fallen, and as she looked back at the fiercely loyal, dangerously protective SEAL who had fought through hell to keep her safe, she knew her life would never be the same.